My name is Harold Whitman, and I turned 76 last winter. Though in my heart I still feel like the man who used to drive a truck across half the country without feeling the ache in his knees or the fog in his head, that age now brings me every morning. I live in a modest single-story house on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, in a neighborhood that has aged almost as much as I have, where the houses all look tired, the paint peeling from porches, and the yards kept up by widows or pensioners like me, who move more slowly each year. My wife, Margaret, passed away 9 years ago, and though people tell me that time heals, I have discovered that time does not heal so much as it numbs, turning grief into a constant background noise, like the ringing in my ears that the doctors say is permanent. I wake up early because I want to, but because my body has decided that sleep is no longer important, and I shuffle to the kitchen to make the same breakfast, black coffee and a slice of dry toast, that I have eaten for years, ever since Margaret left me. Sometimes I pause in front of the window and watch the sun rise over the roofs across the street, and I wonder whether my neighbors, those few still alive, think of me the way I think of myself, as someone who has been quietly pushed aside by the busy world, still standing but no longer noticed. I worked for most of my life as a machinist in an auto parts factory, a job that kept food on the table and shoes on my son's feet, but which also consumed the best hours of my life, leaving me tired and grease-stained when I came home each evening. I was proud of that work because it demanded precision and discipline, and I believed for a long time that my son, Daniel, respected me for it. He used to sit in my lap when he was a boy and ask me about the machines, how they cut metal, how they shaped the parts that made the engines run, and I would tell him about gears and shafts and pistons while he listened with wide eyes. But children grow, and their eyes shift to other things, and the father who once seemed strong and important becomes just another obstacle in the room. Daniel became an insurance salesman, which suited him because he always had the gift of talking people into things, and he married a woman named Claire who never liked me, though she smiled politely enough at family gatherings. They gave me a grandson, Matthew, who is now 19, tall, strong, careless, with the sharp tongue of youth and the arrogance of someone who has never had to fight through real difficulty. I loved that boy from the moment I first held him in my arms, but love does not guarantee respect, and lately I have begun to suspect that to him I am nothing more than a stumbling old relic that can be laughed at. My days are quiet, almost too quiet, filled with routines that keep me anchored but also remind me of what I no longer have. I water the plants Margaret once cared for, though half of them are dying despite my efforts, as if they too cannot live without her. I walk slowly to the mailbox, even when I know nothing but advertisements will be waiting inside. On good days, when my knees allow, I take the bus downtown and sit in the park with a newspaper, pretending to read while I watch young families stroll past. On bad days, I stay indoors and listen to the old records Margaret loved, the scratch of the vinyl filling the empty rooms with memories of a time when laughter and conversation were not rare visitors. There are moments when I almost convince myself that I am content, that the stillness of my house is peace rather than loneliness. But then I remember that contentment is not the same as being forgotten. The truth is that I have always hoped my son would need me, that even in his adult life he would recognize that a father is more than a wallet or a sitter for his child, that wisdom can be found in old age if one only bothers to look for it. But Daniel does not ask for advice, and when he visits, which is seldom, he does not linger. He speaks to me as though I am another client, polite but distant, his eyes already shifting to the next appointment. It is Matthew, my grandson, who is supposed to bring light into these later years. But lately that light has turned harsh, a glare that exposes my weaknesses rather than warming my heart. When he was younger, he would sit beside me and listen to my stories, sometimes even beg me to show him the old tools in my garage. But adolescence hardened him, and by the time he reached college age, he had developed the habit of mocking anything that seemed old-fashioned, and nothing seemed older than his grandfather. I do not know whether Daniel encouraged this or simply failed to correct it, but I do know that in our family gatherings I am no longer treated as the head of the family, not even as a respected elder, but as a character, someone to be tolerated. Occasionally teased, never fully taken seriously. What makes it harder is that I am not entirely without fault. I was a strict father, sometimes too strict, and Daniel carries those memories. I insisted on hard work, on discipline, on saving every dollar. I scolded him when he wanted to buy expensive sneakers. I punished him when he lied, and I never praised him as much as Margaret thought I should. I believed then that I was shaping him into a man, but perhaps I was also shaping his resentment. Now in his adulthood, he has reversed the roles. He acts as though he must manage me, as though I am the child who cannot be trusted with his own decisions. He tells me to stop climbing ladders, to stop driving, to stop cooking complicated meals, and though I know he believes he is protecting me, what I feel is that he is stripping away the last scraps of dignity I have left. And Matthew, watching his father, has learned to treat me as though I am already halfway gone, a man whose opinions and feelings are less real than those of everyone else. I often wonder how much longer I can keep up the illusion that I do not mind. I laugh when Matthew calls me slowpoke for shuffling across the room. I pretend to ignore the smirk when I mishear something, because my hearing is not what it once was. I force a smile when Daniel talks over me, as though my words are background noise. But inside, each small humiliation lands like a pebble in a jar, and the jar is nearly full. What keeps me awake at night is not the loneliness or the pain in my joints, but the creeping suspicion that the people I love most no longer see me as human, that to them I am merely an inconvenience waiting to be resolved. And yet, because they are my blood, I cannot let go of them, and I keep hoping for a moment, a gesture, a word that will tell me I still matter. That is why I cling so fiercely to the rare weekends when Daniel brings Matthew to visit, even though those visits often leave me more drained than uplifted. I clean the house, polish the old silverware, cook Margaret's recipes as best I can, all in the hope that something will spark recognition in them, that they will remember who I was, not just who I have become. I set the table with care, folding the napkins the way Margaret did, lighting the candles she loved, even though I know Daniel will complain the candles make the house smell of wax, and Matthew will laugh at the formality. I do it because it is the last ritual that connects me to a time when family meant respect, and I cannot abandon it. And each time, as I wait for their car to pull up in the driveway, I feel the same nervous anticipation I once felt when I was a young man waiting for Margaret to meet me on a date. The hope that something beautiful might still happen, even when I know it probably will not. I have lived long enough to understand that dignity is fragile, and once it is lost, it is nearly impossible to recover. I have also lived long enough to know that life has a cruel sense of irony, granting us wisdom only when we no longer have the strength to use it fully. What remains to me is memory, and memory is both a comfort and a torment. I remember the days when Daniel looked up to me, when Matthew laughed with me rather than at me, when Margaret's hand in mine made me feel indestructible. Those memories sustain me, but they also remind me of the distance between then and now, and I do not know how to bridge that distance. Perhaps I never will. All I know is that I continue to wake each morning, pour my coffee, and wait for whatever small role is left for me in a family that has already written me out of its script. The Sunday when everything changed began like so many others, with me fussing over details that probably mattered to no one but me, polishing the dining table until the wood shone faintly in the weak winter sunlight, setting out the plates that Margaret had always reserved for family occasions, and putting a pot roast into the oven, because I remembered how much Daniel liked it when he was a boy, even though I had the sinking suspicion that his taste now leaned more toward takeout and restaurant meals. I wanted everything to be perfect, because Daniel had promised to come with Matthew, and even though visits were irregular and often hurried, I still held on to the idea that if the house felt warm and welcoming, if the food tasted good, if I smiled enough and asked the right questions, then perhaps something would soften in my son, and he would remember that he had once needed me. And perhaps my grandson, who now seemed to live mostly in the world of his phone, would lift his eyes long enough to see me not as a doddering shadow, but as someone who had once been strong and worthy of respect. The snow outside had begun to melt into gray slush, the gutters dripping steadily, and as I waited for their car to pull up, I rehearsed little lines in my head, stories from my factory days, a joke I had heard on the radio, anything that might pass. For lively conversation, when the sound of tires crunching over the wet driveway finally came, my heart gave a quick leap, the way it still does, though I quickly reminded myself not to expect too much. Daniel walked in first, brushing the damp from his coat, his face already set in that look of mild impatience that has become so familiar to me, as though even stepping through his father's doorway is something squeezed between more important obligations. Behind him, Matthew entered with the restless energy of a 19-year-old, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying himself with that careless swagger that comes from never having had to doubt his place in the world. He barely glanced at me before dropping onto the couch and pulling out his phone, thumbs moving in a blur, the screen lighting up his face more brightly than any welcome he received from me. I told myself not to mind, not to notice, and instead directed my attention to Daniel, offering him a drink, taking his coat, pretending not to feel the little sting of being overlooked in my own home. We sat down to the meal, and I tried to keep the conversation flowing, asking Matthew about his classes, about his friends, though his answers were mostly shrugs or half-mumbled phrases. And Daniel filled the silence with talk of business, of clients, of how busy things were. I smiled, nodded, tried to keep pace, though much of what he said about policies and premiums blurred in my ears. I was aware, as always, of how stiffly I moved when I reached for the serving spoons, of how carefully I chewed so as not to embarrass myself, of how my hands sometimes trembled when I lifted the glass. It is strange how old age makes you conscious of things that once passed unnoticed, and I could feel Matthew's eyes flick toward me every now and then, not with interest, but with that mocking amusement I have come to dread. Still, I pressed on, telling myself that the important thing was simply to be together, that presence itself mattered more than the quality of the time. After the meal, I insisted on clearing the table myself, though Daniel told me to sit down and rest, his voice carrying that tone people use with children. I carried the plates into the kitchen, balancing them carefully, because the strength in my hands is not what it once was. When I returned with the coffee pot, intending to offer everyone a cup the way Margaret always did, my foot caught on the edge of the rug in the dining room. It was such a small thing, the kind of stumble anyone might make. But in that instant, my balance deserted me, and I pitched forward, the hot coffee sloshing dangerously close to my wrist as I lurched. I tried to right myself, but my knee buckled, and I fell heavily against the side of the table, my shoulder striking the wood with a dull thud before I slid down onto the floor. The pain was sharp, but sharper still was the sudden silence that filled the room, broken an instant later by the sound of Matthew's laughter, loud, unrestrained, the kind of laughter that spills out when something ridiculous happens in a comedy. Show! Except this was not a show. This was me, sprawled on the floor of my own home, humiliated. I will never forget the way his laughter rang out, high and harsh, while I struggled to push myself upright, my palms slipping on the polished floor, my joints protesting with each attempt. Daniel did not scold him, did not hush him, did not even reach down to help me at once. He merely sighed, muttered something about rugs being dangerous, and finally extended a hand after what felt like an eternity. I accepted the help, of course, because pride means little when you are on the ground and cannot rise without assistance. But inside me something cracked. To be laughed at by your grandson, to see your son unmoved by that cruelty, to feel that the fall itself mattered less to them than the inconvenience of it. This was a humiliation I had not prepared myself for. I wanted to shout, to demand respect, to remind them that once I was the man who had carried them both, who had sacrificed years of labor so that they could have comfortable lives. But the words caught in my throat, and instead I brushed off my pants, forced a weak smile, and said I was fine. Matthew kept laughing even after I was on my feet again, shaking his head, repeating under his breath, "Man, that was hilarious. You went down like a sack of potatoes." I felt my ears burning, my chest tightening, but Daniel only chuckled softly as if to say boys will be boys, as if to excuse the insult. "Dad, don't get upset," he said. "He's just a kid. He didn't mean anything by it." But Matthew was not a child. He was nearly 20, strong and healthy, and his laughter was not innocent. It was cruel. In that moment, I realized something that I had been avoiding for years. To them, I was not a father or a grandfather deserving of dignity. I was a source of amusement, a relic to be tolerated, a figure whose stumbles were funny rather than tragic. And once you see yourself reflected in the mocking eyes of your own blood, it becomes impossible to unsee it. I tried to salvage the afternoon, to move past the moment as though it had not happened, pouring the coffee into the cups with hands that shook more than usual, asking about Daniel's office, about Matthew's friends. Though I no longer listened to the answers, my mind kept circling back to the fall, to the laughter, to the look of indulgent irritation on Daniel's face. I remembered all the times I had warned myself not to expect too much, not to hope too much, and yet I had hoped, and now I was paying the price for it. The pain in my shoulder was dull but constant, and every movement reminded me of the indignity. Still, I endured until they decided to leave, Matthew bounding out the door without so much as a backward glance, Daniel patting me on the shoulder in a perfunctory way before following him. I stood at the window and watched their car pull away, and when the house fell silent again, the silence felt heavier than it ever had before, pressing down on me with the weight of shame and sorrow. That night, I could not sleep. I replayed the moment again and again. The stumble, the fall, the laughter, the absence of compassion. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have rushed to me, fussed over me, scolded the others for their rudeness, and I felt the emptiness of her absence more acutely than ever. I thought of the years I had given, of the sacrifices made, of the pride I had once carried, and I wondered when it had all slipped away, when I had become the butt of a cruel joke in my own family. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in my life, I felt not only old, but discarded, as though my existence mattered only in the sense that it provided something to laugh at. The fall itself was not the catastrophe. It was the laughter that followed, the sound of it echoing in my ears long after the house was quiet. That laughter was the true fall, the moment when the fragile dignity I had clung to shattered beyond repair. The following weeks passed in a kind of uneasy fog, for although I tried to push the memory of that Sunday aside, the sound of Matthew's laughter lingered like a wound that refused to close, and every time I moved too quickly and felt the tug in my shoulder from the fall, I was reminded not only of the frailty of my body, but of the fragility of my place in the family. I told myself that perhaps I had exaggerated the cruelty of the moment, that maybe Matthew had not meant to be so harsh, that maybe Daniel's silence had been the result of surprise rather than indifference. But no amount of rationalizing could erase the truth I had felt in that instant, the truth that to them I was no longer a figure of authority or even of affection, but an object to be tolerated, a body taking up space until nature or circumstance removed me. I went about my daily routines with the same slow determination, cooking simple meals, tending the dying plants, shuffling to the mailbox and back. But there was a new heaviness in everything, a sense that the world had tilted in a direction from which it would not right itself. 2 weeks later, Daniel called to say that they would be stopping by again for dinner. And though a part of me recoiled at the thought of reliving another humiliation, another round of half-hearted conversation and silent mockery, another evening in which my house was filled not with warmth, but with the cold presence of people who no longer saw me, I agreed. A father does not turn away his son, and a grandfather does not shut the door on his grandson, even if the love he offers is returned with disdain. I spent the day preparing, moving more slowly than ever, because the ache in my shoulder had not fully faded, but determined nonetheless to set the table with the care Margaret would have wanted, to cook the beef stew she had once perfected, to light the candles and create the illusion of a family gathering worth cherishing. I told myself that perhaps the last visit had simply been a bad day, that maybe this time would be different, that Matthew might look up from his phone long enough to notice me, that Daniel might find the patience to speak to me without that edge of irritation. When they arrived, the atmosphere was casual, almost dismissive, Daniel walking in with a quick, "Hey, Dad," already loosening his tie, Matthew trailing behind with his headphones still draped around his neck, his eyes darting around the room with the restless boredom of someone trapped in a place he did not want to be. I tried to greet them with warmth, offered them drinks, asked about their drive, but my words seemed to fall into an empty space where no one was listening. We sat down to dinner, and as always, I tried to keep the conversation alive, asking Daniel about work, asking Matthew about school, but the responses were clipped, perfunctory, as though they were humoring me. Daniel began talking to his son about sports, about some game on television, and I sat there, eating quietly, pretending not to feel excluded from the very table I had set. The moment of escalation came when I rose to bring more bread from the kitchen. My steps were slower than they used to be, my balance not as steady, and as I crossed behind Matthew's chair, he suddenly stretched out his leg. Whether intentionally or thoughtlessly, I will never know, though in my heart I suspect he knew exactly what he was doing. My foot caught on his sneaker, and before I could catch myself, I stumbled forward, my hands clutching at the back of a chair that slid away from me, and I went down hard, my knee striking the floor with a pain that made me gasp. For an instant the room was still, and I thought perhaps this time they would rush to help me. Perhaps this time compassion would overcome mockery. But then I heard it again, that same sharp, unrestrained laughter spilling out of Matthew, louder than before, ringing through the room like a cruel bell. He slapped the table, doubled over with amusement, and between gasps he managed to say, "Man, Grandpa, you really are clumsy. You went down again, just like last time." Daniel did nothing. He glanced at me, at his son, at the situation, and instead of rebuking Matthew or hurrying to lift me, he only sighed and said, "Dad, you've got to be more careful. These falls are dangerous at your age." At my age, as though my years were not a measure of experience and endurance, but a liability, an excuse to dismiss the indignity of being tripped in my own house. I pushed myself up slowly, wincing, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the table, and I saw Matthew still grinning, still shaking his head as if my suffering were the punchline to a joke told for his amusement. I wanted to shout at him, to demand respect, to remind him that without me he would not even exist. But I bit back the words, because I knew they would fall on deaf ears, and because I understood in that moment that to speak them would not restore my dignity, but only confirm in their eyes that I was a pathetic old man protesting his irrelevance. I returned to my chair, sat down stiffly, and forced myself to finish the meal in silence. Inside me, however, something had shifted. The first fall had been an accident, an embarrassment that could be laughed away if one was cruel enough. But the second, whether deliberate or not, was a confirmation that I was no longer safe even in my own home, that the people who should have protected me had become the very ones who delighted in my weakness. As I chewed the tasteless bread, I made a silent vow. I would no longer allow myself to be humiliated without consequence. I did not yet know what form that resolve would take, but I knew that a line had been crossed, and that whatever affection or loyalty had once held me back was eroding with every echo of Matthew's laughter. After they left that evening, I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the house once again silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, and I felt a cold clarity settle over me. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have defended me, how she would have scolded them for their cruelty, and I felt the ache of her absence as though it were fresh again. I thought of the years I had spent laboring, saving, sacrificing, all so that Daniel could have a better life, and of how easily he now dismissed me. I thought of Matthew, my grandson, my blood, who found delight in watching me fall, and I realized with a kind of grim certainty that the boy who laughed was no longer the little child I once bounced on my knee, no longer the boy who begged me to show him how to use a hammer in the garage, but a young man hardened by entitlement, by indifference, by the example set by his father. I could not change him, but I could decide how I would endure him. That night, as I prepared for bed, moving slowly, my knee wrapped in a makeshift bandage, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, hunched, lined, weary, and for the first time, I did not look away in shame. Instead, I stared into my own eyes and told myself that I was not yet defeated, that dignity is not something others can take unless you hand it to them. They had laughed at my falls, but I would not fall again without purpose. Something inside me hardened, something that had been dormant stirred awake, and though I could not yet see the path ahead, I knew that it would lead me away from helplessness and toward a reckoning. The weeks after that second fall settled over me like a slow-gathering storm, the kind where the air thickens and the sky turns gray long before the rain begins. And though on the surface life went on with its ordinary rhythms, the morning coffee, the trip to the mailbox, the careful preparation of simple meals, inside I knew that something fundamental had shifted. I could no longer look at my son or my grandson in the same way, for whenever I pictured their faces I heard again that laughter, sharp and cutting, and felt the dull ache in my knee, and I knew that what had once been an accident, what I had tried to forgive as carelessness, had become a pattern, a sign of how they truly saw me. My resentment grew quietly at first, a whisper in the back of my mind. But each day that passed without a phone call, each day that my solitude stretched out unbroken, the whisper became a voice, and the voice began to speak with clarity. They do not respect you. They do not even regard you as a man. You are an old body, an embarrassment, a joke, and unless you act, you will die as nothing more than the punchline of their stories. The turning point came on another Sunday when Daniel phoned to say he and Matthew would be dropping by in the evening. I remember sitting with the receiver in my hand for several seconds after the call ended, my stomach tightening, not with excitement or even with the nervous anticipation I used to feel, but with dread, the kind that comes before a confrontation. You. No cannot be avoided. I told myself to cancel, to say I was unwell, but the thought of retreating filled me with shame. And so I prepared as always, though without the careful touches of before. I cooked a simple meal, more for the sake of habit than for their enjoyment, and I waited, my mind heavy with thoughts of what might happen. When they arrived, the mood was careless, almost mocking from the beginning. Matthew strutted in, his phone already in his hand, and after barely acknowledging me, he began to film the room, making some comment about Grandpa's museum of old furniture. And I realized with a jolt that he was recording me too, capturing my every slow step, my bent posture, for the amusement of some unseen audience. Daniel did not stop him. He even smiled faintly, as if indulging a minor mischief. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it meant nothing. But when we sat down at the table and I reached for the salt, Matthew deliberately knocked his water glass over, spilling it across the table. And as I jumped to rescue the plates, my elbow slipped, and once again I lost my balance. This time the fall was not heavy. I caught myself on the chair, but it was enough to send Matthew into a fit of laughter. And before I could even recover my breath, I heard the distinct sound of his phone camera clicking. He had photographed me in that moment of weakness, leaning awkwardly, my face twisted with the effort not to fall. "This is gold," he muttered, his thumbs flying across the screen. And Daniel shook his head, but said nothing. It was then that I felt the cold weight of understanding settle in my chest. They were not only laughing at me in private, they were turning my humiliation into entertainment, into a story or an image to be shared. Perhaps even into proof of the narrative they were constructing. That I was incompetent, that I was weak, that I was no longer fit to manage my own life. I saw it with sudden clarity. Every stumble, every mistake, every lapse of memory was being recorded, filed away, perhaps even prepared as evidence for the day when they would decide to take everything from me, my house, my money, my independence. What else could explain their indifference, their indulgence of Matthew's cruelty, their silence in the face of my pain? I had become not a father or a grandfather, but a case study, a problem to be solved by stripping me of everything I owned and consigning me to some corner where I could no longer inconvenience them. That night after they left, I sat in the dark for a long time, my hands trembling not from age, but from anger. I thought of Margaret and how fiercely she would have defended me. I thought of all the nights I had worked overtime at the factory so Daniel could have new clothes for school. I thought of the afternoons I had carried Matthew on my shoulders through the park, his laughter then so full of joy and trust, and I asked myself how that love had curdled into this mockery. I knew then that the time for hoping, for excusing, for forgiving had ended. I could not erase the past, but I could decide the future, and the future would not be one in which I allowed myself to be humiliated again. I resolved, with a clarity sharper than any I had felt in years, that I would take action, not rashly, not in anger, but with the slow and deliberate strength of a man who has built machines, who has saved every dollar, who has endured without. Complaint. They thought I was weak, but they had underestimated the resilience that had carried me through decades of labor and loss. And now that resilience would be turned not toward survival, but toward justice. For the first time in many years, I felt awake, alive, almost young again, not in body, but in purpose. The midpoint of my story was not the fall itself, but the decision that followed. I would no longer be their victim. They had laughed while I stumbled, but the day would come when their own fall would echo louder than mine. And when it did, I would be standing tall enough to see it. The first sign that my private humiliation had begun to leak into the wider world arrived not from my son or my grandson, but from my neighbor's granddaughter, a quiet high school senior named Lila, who sometimes carried my groceries when the bus dropped me off at the corner, and who, unlike the young man who shares my blood, never spoke to me as though I were a piece of furniture that had lingered too long in a room. She appeared one afternoon on my porch with a face at once embarrassed and furious and asked if she could show me something on her phone. And before I could answer, she tapped the screen, and there I was, reduced to a shaky vertical rectangle, stepping behind a chair and catching my toe, my arms pinwheeling, my mouth opening. In a soundless cry, while a young male voice, Matthew's voice, unmistakable, to me even distorted by the tinny speaker, laughed and narrated my stumble as though it were a slapstick routine. And then there were comments, rows and rows of remarks from strangers who called me Grandpa Fail and Boomer Tumble, and who piled joke upon joke as if my frailty were a public commodity to be traded for amusement. Lila said she had reported the video for harassment and had written to the account asking that it be taken down. But when she checked later, there were more clips, short, cruel compilations of little stutters and hesitations at my table. A moment when I searched for my glasses, a close-up of my hands trembling as I lifted a cup. The captions were clever in the empty way that internet cleverness often is, and the one that made me laugh bleakly because it was so perfectly false read, "We love our Grandpa, but he's a hazard." As if love could coexist with this sort of exhibition, I felt a heat rise in me that was not the mild anger of a wounded ego, but the old, deep furnace of a man who has been cornered and understands at last that his survival depends on moving forward rather than backward. And I thanked Lila, told her not to worry, told her that I was fine. And then I locked the door and sat at my kitchen table for a long time with my hands folded, the way Margaret used to do when she was deciding how to stretch a paycheck through one more week. And I began to make a plan not of revenge in the petty sense, but of reclamation, because that is what was at stake now. Not only my dignity, but my life, the right to live it without being turned into a caricature by the people who should have defended it. The second sign arrived in a more official guise a few days later, when two people from Adult Protective Services knocked at my door. A woman with kind eyes and a serious man who carried a clipboard, and they asked if they could come in because they had received anonymous reports of self-neglect, of an older adult possibly living in unsafe conditions, of repeated falls, of confusion and poor hygiene. And though they would not say who had filed the complaints, I did not need to ask, because I could already hear Daniel's voice rehearsing concern, could see the way he would hold his hands in front of him in a gesture of worry, could imagine the polished phrases about my best interests that he would use with strangers who did not know that. His version of care looked very much like convenience. I invited them in. I showed them the tidy kitchen, the clean sink, the labeled pill organizer on the counter, the grab bars I had installed near the shower years ago when Margaret's knees began to fail. I demonstrated that I knew my medications and my doctor's name and the date of my last appointment, and because I had decided after the night of the photographs that I would not be reactive but proactive, I handed them a letter I had requested from my primary physician attesting that I was oriented, competent, and able to manage my own affairs. The woman read the letter and nodded with something like relief. The man checked boxes on his form, and when they left, they said that while they might follow up with a phone call, they saw no immediate cause for action. And I thanked them without bitterness, because I understood that they were instruments in a machine my son had set in motion, tools that could be used for harm, but that could also, if I remained steady, affirm the truth needed on record. When Daniel called that evening, his voice had the same false softness it always does when he is about to present self-interest as filial duty, and he told me he had heard that some people were worried about me, that perhaps it was time to consider downsizing, to think about supportive living, a phrase so neatly arranged it might have been written by an advertising department, and I listened without interrupting, because I have learned that silence is often the only way to let a man hear himself. He said he had done research, that there were excellent facilities, that my house was old and full of hazards, that Matthew felt awful about the videos and had only meant to raise awareness, that no one was judging me, that we were simply being prudent. I said I appreciated his concern, because I am old enough to know that direct confrontation with men like my son only hardens their resolve, and then I told him I would think about it and that in the meantime I had scheduled my own cognitive evaluation with a neurologist downtown, and there was a pause so brief most people would have missed it, but I have trained my ears on silences all my life, and I knew that this was not the development he had expected. He recovered quickly and offered to drive me to the appointment, and I told him I had already arranged transportation through the senior center, which was not entirely true, but would be by morning, and after we hung up, I sat down and wrote a list. That began not with the usual groceries and bills, but with names. An elder law attorney a former coworker had once mentioned, the bank manager Margaret and I had trusted, the pastor of the church where we had been married, and my neighbor, Mrs. Green, who saw everything on the block and whose memory was better than mine on the days when mine was very good. It is a strange thing to mobilize for a battle against your own blood. Yet that is what I did, not with anger as the fuel, but with an almost technical patience, the same methodical attention I once brought to the milling machine when a piece of steel had to be turned within tolerances so tight a hair would not fit between success and scrap. I met with the lawyer, a calm woman named Alicia Alvarez, who listened without judgment and then explained, in a voice free of drama, the difference between a will and a trust, the value of a durable power of attorney granted to someone you actually trust, rather than someone who assumes he has the right to it, the protections afforded by placing property in a revocable trust with me as trustee, and above successor trustee I selected, and the way these instruments could not stop a determined relative from attempting guardianship, but could make such an attempt more difficult and therefore less likely to succeed. I told her that I wished to revise my will not as a petty punishment, but as a statement of truth, because I could not in good conscience leave my home and savings to a man who would use the fact of my age as a lever to pry my life away from me. I asked whether there was a way to provide for something Margaret had cared about, a scholarship at the community college for students who work with their hands, and I watched the lawyer's face soften almost imperceptibly as she realized this was not a case of an angry old man cutting off his heirs, but of a husband honoring his wife. We drafted documents over 2 long meetings, and when the pen scratched across the paper, I felt not triumph, but a steadiness, as if the floor that had tipped under me for months had finally leveled. And I walked out with a folder that represented not my bitterness, but my autonomy. Around this time, the second wave of escalation from Daniel and Matthew arrived, and it came with the cheap smell of cologne and a briefcase that opened like the mouth of a trap. They brought with them a man introduced as a financial advisor who said he specialized in helping seniors simplify their affairs, and he complimented my neat house, and he spoke in that syrupy tone that so often hides teeth, and he laid out a series of papers that he assured me were routine authorizations for consolidating accounts, adjusting beneficiaries, and preparing for what we all must face eventually, while Daniel hovered just behind him and Matthew lounged in the doorway, trying to appear bored and failing, because I could see the glint of anticipation in his eyes. I asked the man to leave the papers so I could review them at my leisure, and he insisted that it was better to sign while everyone was present to witness. And I said that my eyes were tired and my hearing not what it used to be, and that I had developed a distaste for making important decisions in noisy rooms. And I saw Daniel knuckle his jaw in that way he does when he thinks I am being difficult. But he said nothing, because perhaps he sensed that the ground had shifted in ways he did not yet understand. After they left, I put on the glasses I reserve for reading fine print and discovered that among the harmless forms there was one granting broad power of attorney to Daniel, for the convenience of the principal, and another that would have added Matthew as a joint owner on my largest account, and though I had expected as much, the brazenness of it still took my breath, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what Alicia had explained about tactics that present themselves as care while preparing the way for confiscation. The neurologist's evaluation, which I had arranged without Daniel's help, turned into another front in this strange domestic war, because when Daniel realized he could not control it, he attempted to flank it. He called the office, I learned later, from the nurse who took a liking to me, and inquired whether the tests would be sensitive to episodic confusion he had allegedly witnessed. And then he urged me the night before to come to his house for dinner, so he and Matthew could make a night of it before your big brain day, a phrase that would have been funny if it had not been so transparent. I went because I wanted to see what they would try, and I watched as Daniel poured me a glass of wine far larger than his own, and offered me a new drink he called a nightcap, that tasted of wintergreen and sugar and something else I could not place, and I sipped politely, and then left the glass untouched on the side table, while I pretended to be drowsy, and I waited until Daniel walked Matthew to the garage to whisper about ride times. And then I carried the glass to the sink and poured it down, rinsed it, and set it back, feeling a tiredness that had nothing to do with chemistry wash over me, because it is exhausting to suspect your own son of trying to fog your mind for a test that he hopes you will fail. The next morning I arrived early and clear-headed. I took the battery of assessments. I named animals and subtracted sevens and drew intersecting pentagons and recalled short lists after delays. And when the doctor said, with professional understatement, that my performance was entirely consistent with age and education, and that he saw no evidence of progressive cognitive decline, I felt the peculiar satisfaction of a man who has won not a prize, but a reprieve. I had decided, at Alicia's suggestion, that if they were building a case in shadows, I would bring things into the light. And so I invited Daniel and Matthew over under the pretext of discussing the future. And I made coffee and set the good cups on the table, and I told them, in as level a tone as I could manage, that I had completed a medical evaluation, that the report affirmed my capacity, that I had met with an attorney to ensure my affairs were in order, and that I had established a trust to manage my property with me as trustee and a successor who was not a member of the family. And I watched as the meanings of these words registered like distant thunder moving closer. Daniel tried to smile and said he was glad I was thinking responsibly, but his foot tapped under the table, a tell I remember from his childhood when he would lie about breaking a window, and Matthew, losing the veneer of indifference, demanded to know whether this meant he would get nothing even after all the time we spent with you. And I nearly laughed, not kindly, not cruelly, but with the amazed clarity that comes when the mask slips and the truth shows its face so nakedly that even a grandfather can see what he has refused to see. I said that inheritances are gifts, not wages, and that time spent with family is not a job compensated by property. And Matthew scoffed and muttered something about how his friends would never believe this, and I told him that if his friends still watched the videos of me falling, then they already believed the worst things. That night, after they left with their faces set in the stiff expressions of men who have been denied something they thought inevitable, I sat by the window and listened to the neighborhood settle into its evening quiet. The distant freight horn, the bark of a dog, the whisper of tires on wet pavement, and I understood that the second escalation had not been a single moment, but a series of blows, some petty and some profound, through which my son and my grandson revealed their motives as clearly as if they had read them from a script. The videos and the anonymous calls to authorities, the press to secure signatures and powers, the attempt to blur my mind and sabotage a test, the expectation that I would hand over the keys to my life because it would make theirs easier. Yet in showing me their intentions, they had granted me a gift I had not expected at my age, the gift of certainty. And certainty, I have learned, is a kind of power, because it allows a man to act without hesitation, to endure without second-guessing, to say no without guilt. I had thought dignity was a fragile thing that must be guarded with silence, but I saw now that dignity can also be an instrument, a staff to lean on when the road grows steep, and I resolved that I would carry it like that in the days ahead, not as a display for others, but as a tool for myself. In the weeks that followed, I did small, practical things that felt like acts of defiance precisely because they were so ordinary. I installed a simple doorbell camera not to spy, but to record who came and when. I placed a note by the phone, reminding myself to ask for names and titles whenever anyone called about my well-being. I visited the bank and removed Daniel as an emergency contact, not because I wished to erase him, but because I wished to protect myself from his urgencies. And I asked Mrs. Green if she would mind being my backup if I failed to answer the door, and she patted my arm and said that she had been my backup in spirit for years. I wrote a letter to the pastor explaining in calm language that I might need character references someday, and I tucked a copy of the neurologist's report into the folder with my trust documents, and I slept better, not because my family had changed, but because I had changed the rules by which they could play. And then, as if the world wished to test my new equilibrium, word reached me through the grapevine that Daniel's business was wobbly, that a significant client had left, that there had been unwise personal guarantees, that the easy confidence with which he had spoken about my future had been underwritten not by care, but by debt. And though I felt the old father's reflex to help, to protect, to reach for my checkbook and write my way out of his trouble, I did not, because I finally accepted that to rescue him would be to invite a fresh round of contempt, and to refuse him would be to offer him the only hard lesson his life had spared him. If this sounds cold, if it sounds like a man becoming flinty in his old age, then perhaps you do not understand the arithmetic of respect, which is not a ledger of money given and favors returned, but the stubborn equation of how a person chooses to see you. I had spent years trying to prove that I was worthy of kindness by extending it first, and it had not worked. And now I was trying something different. A stance not of hostility, but of deliberate distance. And I could feel, even in the small, daily tasks, the measured sweep of the kitchen floor, the careful tying of my shoes, the steady handwriting in my check register, that a different version of Harold was surfacing, one that belonged to me and not to their narrative. The second escalation, with its parade of indignities and schemes, had done me the accidental service of stripping away every illusion. And in that harsh light, I rediscovered something I had not expected to find again: the quiet pride of a man who knows his worth without needing his son or his grandson to confirm it. The breaking point came sooner than I expected, on a rainy Thursday evening when Daniel called me with a voice both tight with anger and heavy with the forced politeness that fooled no one. And he said that Matthew had gotten into serious trouble at the university, that there had been a fight, that another boy had ended up in the hospital, that disciplinary hearings were looming, and that without intervention Matthew could be expelled and possibly face charges. His words were rushed, stacked one on top of another, as if by drowning me in the urgency of the situation he could make me forget everything that had passed between us. As if suddenly I would be the same pliant father who had always opened his wallet and smoothed the path for his son, no matter how rocky it had grown. He said he needed money for a lawyer, a lot of money, quickly. And then he paused, and I could hear his breathing, waiting for the familiar sound of surrender. For me to say, "Of course, Daniel, you're my son. Of course I will help." But something inside me that had been simmering for months rose up, calm and immovable, like a stone finally set in its rightful place. And instead of reaching for my checkbook, I said very quietly, "No." There was a silence so deep that for a moment I wondered if the line had gone dead, and then he burst out, his voice full of incredulous fury. "What do you mean, no? He's your grandson. Do you want him to be ruined? Do you want his life destroyed?" And I answered, still calm, "Do you remember when I fell?" And he laughed. "Do you remember when you looked away and told me I was old? As if that explained everything. Do you remember the videos, the mockery, the way you tried to make me small in my own home? If I helped him now, I would be telling him that cruelty has no consequence, that he can laugh at a man's dignity and still expect that man to pay his way out of trouble. I won't do it, Daniel. Not anymore." He swore at me then, words I never thought I would hear from my own son, harsh and raw, accusing me of betrayal, of heartlessness, of abandoning family. And then he hung up. I sat there in the stillness of my little kitchen, the rain drumming on the roof, and I felt not guilt, not fear, but a steady quietness, as if for the first time in years I had spoken with the full weight of my own voice, as if my spine had straightened after years of bending. The next days were full of angry calls, first Daniel again, then Matthew himself, his voice cracking between arrogance and panic, insisting that I had to help, that I owed him, that blood was thicker than water. And then his tone shifted to threats, that I would regret this, that I would die alone, that I would be remembered as the grandfather who abandoned his kin. I listened, and when he paused for breath, I told him that perhaps this was his lesson to learn, that a man who laughs when another falls must one day learn what it feels like to fall himself, and that no one can buy their way out of gravity. His voice broke into sobs then, real fear cracking through the bravado, and for a fleeting moment I felt the old instinct to protect. But I held it back because protection had long ago been twisted in their hands into license, and license had grown into entitlement, and entitlement had curdled into cruelty. When the court hearings came for Matthew, I did not attend, though I was invited. Though Daniel begged me at the last moment to appear as a character witness, I imagined myself standing there, saying that he was a good boy, that he had simply made a mistake, and I saw that my words would not be the truth. They would be another lie added to the pile, and I refused. The reports came later that Matthew had been suspended, that the other boy's family was pursuing charges, that his scholarship was gone, that he would have to work if he wanted to finish his studies. And I sat by the window of my new apartment, the quiet place I had chosen for myself, and I felt the sharp edge of satisfaction, not because he suffered, but because justice, for once, had not been purchased. The climax of my life was not a confrontation with fists or shouting in a crowded room. It was this moment of refusal, this moment when I broke the cycle of giving and being demeaned, of being needed only as a source of money and mocked as a source of weakness. It was the moment when I stood not above them, but apart from them, when I realized that the love I had carried for my son and grandson had been twisted into chains, and by saying no, I had at last broken them. That night, alone, but not lonely, I poured myself a modest glass of wine, raised it toward the photograph of Margaret on the shelf, and whispered, "I did it, my love. I finally stood up, and in the silence of the room, I felt her presence, not in words, but in the stillness of my heart. Steady, proud, at peace. I had expected that after the refusal, the days would turn brittle with regret, that I would second-guess myself in the long quiet of the evenings and invent softer versions of the past to justify calling my son back. But the opposite happened, because once the word no left my mouth and settled in the world, like a post driven deep into hard ground, the house itself seemed to right its posture. The rooms regained their plain dignity, and I began to move through them with the unhurried steadiness of a man who finally walks in shoes that fit. The calls grew less frequent, tapering from fury to clipped updates to long silences. And when news did come, it arrived through other people. A neighbor who mentioned that Daniel's office had downsized. The pastor who said he had seen Matthew at the food pantry asking about volunteer hours for the court. The nurse from my clinic who, lowering her voice, told me the videos were gone, taken down with a note that said only not funny, and, though I had not asked for retractions or apologies, the subtraction felt like a window unlatched in a stale room, letting in a little weather and the faintest smell of rain. I did what men who have survived disappointment always do when they do not wish to sour into bitterness. I made a small life large with precision, rose early to grind coffee the way Margaret liked it, learned the names of the sparrows at the feeder, walked to the senior center 3 times a week, and let the physical therapist talk me into a set of careful exercises that strengthened the legs the world had decided were finished. And, because I wanted Margaret's name to mean something more than a framed photograph above my table, I met with the community college and signed papers that created a modest scholarship for students in the machining program, the kind of young people who arrive with calluses and leave with blueprints in their heads. And on the morning, they unveiled a brass plate with her name. I stood in the hum of the training shop and felt the old music of steel on steel rise through the floor into my bones. It was there that Lila dragged me to a stool and told me to speak to the class for 5 minutes, and I ended up talking for 30. Not about my family or the hurts I had carried, but about tolerances and patience, and the way a tool teaches you what you are by punishing your hurry. And when the students clapped, I laughed, because praise at my age lands not like applause, but like a hand steadying your elbow on a step you had not noticed. And afterward, the instructor asked whether I would consider coming by twice a month to show the first years how to square a block and read a micrometer, which is how, without any grand decision, a retired widower found himself useful again. The first time I saw Matthew after the hearings, it was not at a table with Daniel speaking for him, but at the loading dock of a hardware store where the college keeps its supplies. And if you think I am going to pretend that I did not stop and simply watch him for a full minute, then you do not understand what it is to be a grandfather who has outlived illusions. Because I stood there under a gray sky and studied the boy who had laughed when I fell, ash-pale and unshaven, moving lumber with the slow care of someone who has been taught by pain to respect weight, and when he turned and saw me, he startled, the way a deer does when it realizes the figure on the path is human. And then he looked down, as if the asphalt itself were suddenly fascinating. And for a long beat neither of us spoke. I was the one who broke the silence, not with a lecture and not with a question, but with a sentence so simple it surprised me by its mercy. "You're working," I said. And he nodded and said, "Yes, sir." And the "sir" was the smallest apology I have ever been given, and the truest. He did not ask for money, and I did not offer it. And instead, we walked the length of the dock, looking at pallets and schedules like 2 men discussing the weather. And as we reached the end, he cleared his throat and said he had taken the videos down, and he had written to some people to say he was wrong, and that he did not know how to ask me for forgiveness without sounding as if forgiveness were another thing he was trying to get from me. And I told him that forgiveness is not a transaction, but a direction, that we could both start walking toward it from where we stood, and that the distance would be closed by consistency rather than speeches. Over the next months he came by on Saturdays when his shifts allowed, not for meals, those came later, but to help me carry the shop vac from the garage, or to replace a flickering bulb that had been flickering for a year because I had been too proud to admit it made me nervous to climb the step stool. And on one of those afternoons he tripped over the curled edge of the doormat and pitched forward with the exact helpless flail I knew so well, and I reached out and caught him by the elbow before he hit the floor, and we stood there looking at each other, both of us breathing too hard for what had actually happened. And he said, "I get it now." And I answered, "I know." And we left it at that, because sometimes a lesson, once learned, does not need a sermon built on top of it. As for Daniel, he came once, not with the bluster I had come to expect, but with a tiredness that looked almost like honesty. And he sat at my table and admitted that he had mistaken management for love, that he had wanted my life arranged because arrangement is easier than attention. And I said I did not know whether we would ever be friends, but that I believed we could be decent. And we agreed to build something narrower than closeness and sturdier than estrangement. A bridge of small courtesies measured not in years, but in phone calls returned and holidays navigated without old poisons. I did not revise my trust to restore what I had taken away, though I added a clause that if a certain young man finished a degree or a trade certificate without disciplinary marks, he would receive a set of tools that had been mine, and then the small, some necessary to start a shop of his own. And I told no one, because hope, like a seed, grows better in the ground than waved around in the air. In the evenings, I still sit with Margaret's picture and tell her what I did with the day. And I like to think that if there is any listening left in the universe, she hears a husband who finally learned the difference between rescuing and respecting, between penance and change. And I also like to think she smiles at the notion that the old machinist found a way to pass down, not money, but measure, not grievance, but grit. I will not pretend that loneliness never visits. It does, and sometimes it sits heavy in the chair across from me and clears its throat like a relative who does not know when to leave. Yet even on those nights I feel steadier than I once did, because I understand at last that dignity is a daily craft, something shaped the way I shape my coffee in the morning or the way I show a student to level a vice, and that a man can be alone without being diminished if he refuses to laugh at his own falls, and refuses to let those who laughed before turn his memory into their pastime. In the end, the story is simple, and to me, sufficient. I fell, and they laughed. And then life, which keeps its own ledgers, arranged matters so that the one who laughed learned how far and how hard a man can drop when the floor disappears. And when he began to climb, I was waiting, not with the softness that says nothing matters, and not with the hardness that says nothing can be repaired, but with the kind of open hand a grandfather extends when he has finally learned that love without boundaries is simply permission, and boundaries without love are simply walls, and that between the two there is a narrow, honest road on which the old can walk beside the young without either having to carry the other.